Yep.
Can you turn your mic on? In the pocket.
Got too many pockets.
Yeah, just turn it on and pull it right across.
Okay. Alright, we're away. How many kids like stories? We all like stories. How many kids like water? We all like water. And big fishes in the water. Now, can you tell me what is a missionary? Yeah.
Someone that goes around the world and tells people about God.
Yes. And where do they do that? Anywhere?
Anywhere.
What about out in the islands?
Yeah, like Samoa.
It's like Noah. Okay.
Samoa.
Samoa. Yes, you're right. Just hang on a minute.
And Samoa. What's it called? Solomon Islands.
What is one of those islands?
I've got a cap here. And I was invited to go out to the Solomon Islands.
Solomon,
Can you read what's on it?
Solomon Islands.
What's it say on it?
It says, I can't read it.
Copic School.
Copic School,
Sid-
Solomon Islands,
That's it?
2008.
How do they pronounce it? Capu. In the Solomon Islands. We went out there. This one says 008. There was other times as well, but that was in 008, that hat. Now, when we were out there, we had to take oil drums out there because we had to have petrol, kerosene, and various other things, oils. But on the way home, we were sailing along beautifully, and we had a 18-foot boat behind us that we were towing. We were in a 35-foot boat, and the wind was blowing nicely, and we were sailing along very, very nicely. We were doing about 8 to 9 knots, and suddenly, pardon? And suddenly we had a wind come up, and rain, and the water out there is roughly, where we were anyway, was 300 feet deep. And the waves come up and they were huge. And we lost the boat behind us. So we turned around in these big waves and we went back to rescue the boat. We've got it and we tied it back up again. And we only went a short distance and we lost the boat again. And this time when we went back to to tie the boat on, we found that the eye in the front of the boat had been pulled right out. So we had to put a rope through the hole in the front and tie it on the back seat in the boat. Now this was all right, so we went on a few more miles and the rope broke again. And this time we were getting close to the reef. And there was a coastline along here, and nearly all around Solomon Islands it's got a coral reef. And you have huge breakers breaking over it at any time, even in calm seas. But this time they were huge. But anyway, we turned around to go back to get it, and by this time it's night time. So we were in seas, huge seas, and we had a big spotlight, searchlight, shining all over the water trying to find this boat. And finally we found it, but when we found it, it was right close to where the reef was and we couldn't go in to get it. Yes, it was all right. And while we were looking for this boat this time, there was a man sitting on a plastic chair like we have out here. And when we turned around, we went over a big wave like this, and the chair slid across the deck, and legs broke off it, and the chair went under the rail. And as the man went under the rail with the chair, he grabbed onto the wire on the rail and hung on, and we pulled him back onto the deck. Almost lost him. And to make it even worse, before we got that far, when we would be going over that wave, this one here would be coming over here and sliding down this side, and it would come up here with such speed, we would almost ram into the back of the sailboat. Several times it just missed the boat, come up alongside it and missed it, only by a matter of a few feet. If it hit the back of the boat and stove in the back of the boat, would have all gone down. Anyway, we lost a boat there, and this boat had a brand new 40 horsepower motor on the back of it. And we watched it with the searchlight, and the last time we saw it, it disappeared in a big white breaking wave over the top of all the rocks. And we thought, that's the end of that boat. So anyway, we went up the coast a little bit further, and we turned into an inlet in it. And what do you think the inlet was like?
Calm.
It was just like a mill pond. Not any waves, it was just dead flat. And we no sooner dropped the anchor there, and a man came running up, jumped in a canoe, and paddled out and banged on the side of our boat. And we looked over the side and said, what's the problem? Oh, we've got your boat, but we want $2,000 and we'll give it back to you. So, you know Irvin Ferris?
Yes.
Irvin was there, and he was born in the Solomon, so he's a Solomon Islander. He leaned over the boat and he negotiated with them, and he bought it back for $1,000. So we anchored in the shelter of this bay all night, and the first light the next morning, the engineer went down with the natives, and they started the motor and brought it back up. That boat had gone over the top of all the coral reef, into the lagoon along the beach, and there wasn't a scratch on the boat.
Wow.
Not even a scratch. But it cost us $1,000 to get it back again. So the natives come out the next morning after they'd brought the boat back, and after they'd received their $1,000, and they run up here onto the beach. There was a little village in here. They run up to the village, and about 6 or 8 of them jumped into the boat. They started the motor, and they headed for Honiara. They had money to spend. Okay, could you give me my Bible, please? And they're beautiful people out there. Thank you. Now for the adults, if they want to turn to Luke 8, we start at verse 21. And this is Jesus talking, kids. And Jesus said, let's go over the lake. We'll take a boat and we'll go over the lake. And they launched forth in their boat. But then as they sailed, Jesus went to sleep. And he put his head down, I guess on the ropes or whatever it was there. He laid down and he went sound asleep. And these waves were coming over the side of the boat. And we had a man with us in this boat. He was dead scared. He was sitting right close to the rail, hugging. He had his arm around the top rail, and he was hugging that rail like as if it was going to fall off. But I don't think he was all that much of a swimmer, but he wasn't going below. He was going to sit on top. If the boat was going to go down, he was going to be in the water at the top. Anyway, the disciples came to Jesus and they said, the boat's filling up with water. What can we do? And Jesus said, where's your faith? Do you think there's any people on this boat praying?
Yeah.
They were having a really prayer meeting, I can tell you. And the disciples were afraid, and one said to another, what man is this? He can command even the waves and the wind, and they stop. It's amazing, isn't it? Jesus can just tell the wind what to do, and it will do it. And it reminds me so much, when we come round the end of that point, we come into that little bay, we went from breakers like this to dead flat water, because the wind was blowing this way, of course. And we had a calm, nice sleep there. And the following morning we went away, going Monday. It had gone back to little tiny waves out in the ocean. But you know, you've only got to pray, haven't you? In faith that Jesus... I remember the last time I was here, they had a frisbee.
A lot of praying over that frisbee.
Yes, much prayed over frisbee. So what happened when you prayed? Who remembers going out and finding the frisbee? We're lost in the long grass.
Me.
Yeah, there you go. There's a boy there, the girl here.
Me. No, wasn't me.
Now remember, as you go through life, something happens and you can't find something, pray and ask Jesus. It's amazing how he will help you.
He still does that for the big people too.
Oh.
Amen.
Okay,
Thank
God
you,
bless.
Thank you, Ron.
Must we just keep going?
Okay.
Where you going?
I just got a text message this morning from Scott and Wendy. They were sitting there watching the morning session. And God bless to everyone at Ridgey.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Mom's watching.
Just, I'll grab the mic.
We've got the microphone.
It's something with the reaction to.
No.
Let me
Wow.
try that. I'll turn it back on.
Just sit up.
Okay.
Just turn it on. Yeah, why is that frozen?
That is the.
It's not on the slide thing. F5 does that. Just click in there for me. Just click here. See, it's up there, so the slide's running.
Is the remote turned on?
No, it's. This isn't running
We had a
properly.
joke about that yesterday.
A little prayer. Yeah, pray.
This is all
It is
yours.
fixed. Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming along. This second session. We talked yesterday about William Miller and the lead up to the events of 1843 and 44. And it's just a wonderful thing to contemplate history and how God has worked in history right from the very beginning. But in very recent times, it's just amazing. Our knowledge or lack of knowledge of history, even in our own families. Like, I know back as far as my grandfather, and that's about it. I don't know anything about his life other than he was my grandfather, and beyond him, nothing. History is an amazing thing, and we can learn so much from it. So before we start, we'll just ask our Father in heaven to be with us. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the opportunity to be here at this appointed time, to be gathered together in love and in worship. And as we contemplate the way that you have led your people of recent times, we just ask that you would be with us, to shower us with your blessings. And we thank you for everything you have done for us. In Jesus' name, amen. As we learnt yesterday, William Miller, there were others, but William Miller was the focus of the lead up to the Great Disappointment. And he'd uncovered, if you like, the secrets or the way to read the books of Daniel and Revelation, and had learnt a great deal from that, and particularly about the 2,300-day prophecy. And he was an Adventist. He believed in the second coming of Jesus Christ, and as we heard, up to 100,000 people were waiting for that great event, and then they were greatly disappointed. William Miller himself never went on to become a Seventh-day Adventist. He did not accept the Sabbath. But other people who were bitterly disappointed at that time, some went back to their churches, some people gave it up altogether, and a very small group, a number of small groups actually, continued on trying to work out what happened. So this is called the transition from Adventist to Seventh-day Adventist Part 1, and we have a second session next week. As you can imagine, I'll just start again with remembering a Revelation 10 to 11. And I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And I was told, you must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and languages and kings. As you can imagine, in the days following October 22, 1844, a virtual tide wave of negative emotions threatened to engulf and destroy the Advent believers. They felt humiliation, confusion, doubt and disappointment. And I think we can all understand how they would feel. How could faith survive in that sort of environment? For many, it didn't. But there were hundreds who were determined to retain the blessed hope. Unwilling and unable to face their jeering neighbours, they were holed up in homes, poring over their Bibles. Gradually they began gathering together to comfort and encourage each other. By the end of October, the Advent Herald, the former Signs of the Times, and the Midnight Cry had resumed publication. William Miller said, although twice disappointed, I am not yet cast down or discouraged, surrounded with enemies and scoffers. Yet my mind is perfectly calm, and my hope in the coming of Christ is as strong as ever. Miller and Himes remained convinced that Christ would return after the 2,300-day period. They said that they were wrong in stating it ended on October 22nd, 1844. However, Joseph Marsh, in his Voice of Truth publication, as early as November 7, 1844, was admitting that they had been mistaken in the nature of the event to occur on October 22nd, 1844. And among other theories to explain October 22nd, 1844 was the shut door theory. And we've been looking at that a little bit lately. Advanced by Apollos Hale of the Advent Herald and Joseph Turner of the Hope of Israel. They effectively said that probation closed on October 22nd, 1844, and as a consequence, many Adventists no longer felt a burden for sinners. The renewed searching of the Bible convinced some Adventists that they should adopt long ignored Bible practices, such as keeping the seventh day as the Sabbath, engaging in the ordinance of foot washing and greeting fellow believers with a holy salutation, an embrace and a kiss. In an attempt to maintain harmony, unity and orthodoxy, Miller and Himes announced a conference of Second Advent lecturers and brethren who still adhere to the original Advent faith to meet at Albany, New York on April 29, 1845. The conference delegates came largely from the eastern states. No delegates came from Maine or Ohio, where many strange theories had arisen. The conference reaffirmed Millerite teachings minus the time element and suggested congregational type organisation for Adventist groups. They urged continued work for the salvation of sinners through preaching and a wider distribution of literature. Resolutions were passed directly condemning foot washing and the holy salutation, and indirectly the seventh-day Sabbath. Such a strong stand practically assured permanent division among Adventists. By the time of Miller's death in December 1849, Adventism was fragmenting into several splinter groups. There were Sabbatarian Adventists and 3 other fairly coherent groups in existence by 1854. The first centred around Boston and looked to Himes, Bliss and Hale for leadership. They formed the American Evangelical Adventist Conference. They developed increasingly strong ties with major Protestant churches, and being the only Adventist group to still believe in the immortality of the soul, eventually lost any reason for separate existence. A second Adventist group developed in the Hartford, Connecticut, New York area around Joseph Turner and his publication Second Advent Watchman. They believed that the millennium was in the past, that death was asleep, and in the final annihilation of the wicked. In 1862, Himes accepted the soul sleep doctrine and joined with this group to form the Advent Christian Church, which was the largest Sunday-keeping remnant of Adventism. A third group, centered largely around Rochester, New York, rallied behind Joseph Marsh. They opposed any sort of formal organisation. They saw the millennium as future. During the millennium, they expected a second period of probation when the Jews would return to Palestine. Their persistent objections to organisation kept these age to come Adventists from being strong and united. However, even before the Albany Conference, various elements of Adventism, at first referred to as the Sabbath and Shut Door Brethren, began to emerge. Scattered across Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts and Western New York, these believers, for the most part laymen or minor Advent lecturers, had but slight contact and no coherence. Only Joseph Bates among them had any prominence in Millwright circles. Yet gradually, through prayer, extensive Bible study and what they saw as divine encouragement, they worked out a series of doctrines that explained their disappointment in 1844. They were to eventually become the largest of all Advent bodies. In 1843, Rachel Oakes, a widowed Seventh-day Baptist, moved to Washington, New Hampshire, to be near her daughter, Delight, a schoolteacher. In the early spring of 1844, she came into contact with Frederick Wheeler, an Advent-believing Methodist farmer minister. She challenged him to keep all God's commandments, just as he had said in a recent sermon that men were obliged to do. After serious study of the fourth commandment, Frederick Wheeler accepted the seventh day as Sabbath and began to keep it. About the same time, several members of the Washington congregation made similar decisions. Thus, the first Sabbath-keeping Adventist congregation came into being in Washington even before the Great Disappointment. Toward the end of that same summer in 1844, a more prominent Advent minister, a former Baptist, Thomas M. Preble, who had travelled with Miller, also accepted the seventh-day Sabbath. It's not clear whether he heard from Wheeler or Mrs. Oakes. Since both Preble and Wheeler expected Christ's return in a few weeks, neither felt a burden to convince fellow Adventists of the Sabbath. In March 1845, Preble published a 12-page tract on the Sabbath titled A Tract, showing that the seventh day should be observed as the Sabbath instead of the first day, according to the commandment. In the middle of 1847, Preble switched his views back to Sunday sacredness, but his tract fell on fertile ground. Joseph Bates was a retired sea captain who, in 1839, after years of careful study, began to preach William Miller's views on an imminent second coming. Bates was one of the committee who called the First Advent General Conference in 1840, and he presided over the Sixth General Conference in May 1842. Although twice bitterly disappointed during 1844, Bates did not renounce his Advent hope or his belief that something important happened on October 22, 1844. When Bates read Preble's tract, he studied his Bible earnestly and quickly became convinced of the logic of Preble's Sabbath article. Learning of Sabbath-keeping Adventists in New Hampshire, Bates arrived unannounced at the home of Frederick Wheeler at 10 p.m, and they studied the Bible for the rest of the night. After that, Bates was a confirmed Sabbath keeper. About a year after Preble published his tract, a copy fell into the hands of 15-year-old Marion Stowell. The Stowell family had sold their farm in expectation of the Advent and were living with Edward Andrews and his family. Marion, and her older brother Oswald were convinced about the Sabbath. Marion shared the tract with Andrew's 17-year-old son, John. John Andrews was a serious boy who was considering a career in law and politics. The logic of the Sabbath captured him, and soon both families became Sabbath-keeping Adventists. John Andrews would go on to publish the first book-length Adventist defence of the Sabbath, combining it with an historical survey of how Christians had come to switch their allegiance to Sunday. It would have been pretty extensive. Hiram Edson was a Methodist farmer from Port Gibson, New York, on the morning of October 23, 1844, the day after the Great Disappointment, following a prayer session in which they pleaded with God for more light to explain the disappointment. Edson, accompanied by Owen Crozier, was walking across a cornfield to visit and encourage other disappointed Adventists. Heaven seemed to open to my view, Edson remembered, and I saw distinctly and clearly that instead of our high priest coming out of the most holy of the heavenly sanctuary to come to this earth at the end of the 2,300 days, that he for the first time entered on that day the second apartment of that sanctuary, and he had a work to perform in the most holy before coming to this earth. His mind was also directed to Revelation 10 and the prophecy of the little book that tasted sweet but was bitter to the stomach. He recalled that the angel instructed to prophesy again. Later, as Edson and Crozier studied together, Edson's Bible fell open to Hebrews 8 and 9, where they found confirmation that the sanctuary that was to be cleansed was the heavenly temple. Over the next few months, Edson, Crozier and Dr. F.B. Hahn carried out an intensive study of the Hebrew sanctuary and sacrificial system. Crozier then wrote a lengthy article which was published under the rather ambiguous title of The Law of Moses. Read that if you can. Thus, the heavenly sanctuary concept was exposed to a broad range of Adventists. The most important points were a real, literal sanctuary existed in heaven. On October 22nd, 1844, Christ moved from the first apartment to the second apartment of this sanctuary. Christ has a work to do in the most holy place that differs from what he had been doing since his ascension. The Hebrew sanctuary system was a complete visual representation of the plan of salvation, with each type having its antitype. The real purpose of the Day of Atonement is to prepare a cleansed people. That's a little bit different to what we thought, isn't it? Christ's cleansing in the heavenly sanctuary also involves cleansing the hearts of his people. The typical scapegoat represents not Christ, but Satan. Satan will receive the ultimate guilt for the sins he has caused people to commit. And atonement for sin did not begin until Christ entered the heavenly sanctuary following his resurrection. Now that concept of Satan receiving the ultimate guilt for the sins he has caused God's people is something that's only really becoming, I think, understood by us. To do with the fire coming out from the midst of him. Somewhere between late 1845 and the middle of 1846, Joseph Bates heard about Crozier's ideas. Bates met with Edson, who accepted the Sabbath teaching from Bates, and Bates agreed that the Edson-Crozier position on the sanctuary document was correct. So were joined two of the doctrines that were to become distinctive tenets of the emerging Seventh-day Adventist faith. Ellen Harmon was just 16 when she and her family became convicted of William Miller's message of the Second Advent. Her family's acceptance of the Advent message led to their expulsion from the Methodist Church. One December day in 1844, Ellen was praying with a group of 4 Adventist sisters when she was given her first vision from God. In it she saw a straight and narrow path leading to heaven. A brilliant light was behind them, lighting the way, but some Adventists became discouraged at the distance still to go, and lost their way and fell off the path. About a week later, Ellen Harmon received a second vision, instructing her to go and tell others what God had told her. She was warned of the trials and opposition she would face. The commission seemed too great. There had been deep suspicion in the Millerite movement of visions, dreams, or private revelations. This opposition had already kept two other Adventists from accepting the commission when offered to them. Early in 1842, William Foy, a Baptist studying for the episcopal ministry, received two visions dealing with Christ's soon return and the reward of righteousness. Foy initially told large audiences in New England about his visions, but later financial pressure and a third vision that he did not understand led Foy to stop recounting his experiences. Shortly before the Great Disappointment, Hazen Foss was given a vision apparently very similar to the first vision of Ellen Harmon. When shown the opposition he would encounter, he refused to accept the commission. When suddenly impressed that he had grieved the Holy Spirit, Foss convened a meeting to tell of the vision, only to find that he could not recall it. Weeks later, he happened to hear Ellen Harmon, whose older sister had married his brother, describe what she had seen. Foss warned Ellen not to refuse God's call. As for himself, he demonstrated no more interest in spiritual matters. James White heard the Advent message at the Advent camp meeting held in Exeter, Maine in 1842. Just 21 years old, White left school teaching to become an Advent lecturer. Armed with 3 lectures, a borrowed horse and a patched saddle, he set out. He soon had 60 repentant sinners asking for baptism. He went on facing real physical danger at times from mobs who hurled snowballs and other objects at him. After one 6-week campaign of lectures, he could report 1,000 conversions. He was ordained as a minister in the Christian Connection. In 1845, James White observed Ellen Harmon during a visit she made to Orrington, Maine, and was immediately convinced of her prophetic gift. As Ellen only travelled with her sister Sarah or Louisa Foss, James White sensed a need for male support and began going to appointments with them. This led to gossip, even though there was no romantic inclinations at this point. Both expected Christ's return soon, and to consider marriage could be interpreted as a denial of their faith. However, love did grow, and James became convinced that nothing should be allowed to bring reproach on Ellen and her work. So he proposed marriage. Ellen accepted, and on August 30, 1846, as young people without formal church membership, they were married by a justice of the peace in Portland. It was probably in the spring preceding her marriage that Ellen first met Joseph Bates. He treated her with utmost courtesy, but was frankly sceptical of her visions as direct revelations from God. Ellen and James disagreed. Excuse me. Thanks, Craig. Thirsty work. Something in there that does not want to come out. Ellen and James disagreed with Bates' stand on the seventh-day Sabbath. They believed he stressed the fourth commandment unduly. However, in the autumn months of 1846, the newly married Whites carefully studied Bates' pamphlet, The Seventh-day Sabbath, a Perpetual Sign, and were convinced by it. Bates' acceptance of Ellen White's visions came after observing her experience in several of them. One in particular impressed him. In it she described some of the heavenly bodies. Bates loved astronomy and knew from earlier discussions with Ellen that she knew nothing about it. So how else could this sudden enlightenment be explained? by 1847, Bates could confirm that he believed the visions were from God. Up to 1846, Ellen's visions had been largely of an encouraging and practical nature, designed to keep the believer's attention focused on Christ's return. Then she began to receive confirmation of new doctrinal discoveries. And note that she received confirmation of new discoveries. She didn't offer light on those discoveries. So Ellen was shown in vision that Crozier had the true light on the cleansing of the sanctuary and the sanctuary services, and that it was God's will that Crozier should write out the view which he gave. She felt fully authorised by the Lord to recommend the Day Star Extra, the paper that published Crozier's work, to every saint. In April 1847, several months after Ellen and James began keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, she received a vision of the most holy place and the Decalogue inside the ark. A special halo of glory seemed to encircle the fourth commandment. She was instructed that true Sabbath observance would play a vital role in the troublesome times God's people would experience just before the second advent. The connection between the Sabbath and the third angel's message of Revelation 14 was pointed out to her. Joseph Bates had also noted this relationship in the second edition of his Sabbath tract. And so now we have the pillars of the Sabbath, the sanctuary, the gift of prophecy, and the third angel's message all coming into acceptance. And there we will leave it until the final part of the series, where we'll cover the period from 1847 to the 1860s and see the emergence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I don't know if Mark pointed it out to me the other day. There's a lot of information on the internet about the inaccuracy of Ellen White's prophecies. And one that came to my mind, because I thought I'd go and have a look at that last night, almost the first one that came up was an accusation that Ellen White had incorrectly prophesied or foretold the coming of Christ in 1843, 1844, 1845, and then 1851. But that is quite easily debunked. Like, she did not do those things. The 1851 was an interesting one, because in that she said that Christ's return would be soon. She didn't say it would be in 1851. She said it would be soon, and that people would only have months to learn what they had spent 6 years in learning. But you can see how somebody could interpret that as a prediction that Christ would come in 1851. But that's not what she said. So, and I've gone through quite a few of them, and it's really interesting that that another one was that she said that we heard God announce the hour and the day, and that's interpreted as saying that, well, she would still be alive at that point, and obviously she is not still alive, but it doesn't preclude the possibility that she will actually be alive at the return of Christ in the special resurrection. So lots of interesting things in there, but people posting all over the internet to debunk the possibility that Ellen White might actually be inspired.
Well, you can't help it. People have already been deceived.
Mm.
They don't want to happen again.
Mm. But in my experience, I grew up with Ellen White shoved down my throat. I was never actually shown what Ellen White wrote. Just was told Ellen White said this and Ellen White said that, and I had pretty much of Ellen White by the time I was 15.
Mrs. White says. Sister White says.
Yeah, but I must say that the understanding and even looking at the way Ellen White wrote, that many things you have to use the mirror to really get at what she's saying. It's written in exactly the same vein as the Bible. And as we were talking about source and channel this morning, I've come to understand that the Bible is definitely the source. It's the Word of God in primary form for us, but in these last days, Ellen White's writings are a channel, not the only channel, but a channel by which we can gain a better understanding of the Word of God. So I've been quite absolutely amazed by that. So going from a complete disbeliever to a complete belief that Ellen White was inspired to give us this information. And that description of Satan's rebellion, there's nothing unbiblical in that. It completely explains why the rebellion occurred in the first place. So I've been greatly blessed by those understandings. So until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you. And then pray first, then shall I pray?
Good idea.
Yeah.
Yep. Father in heaven, thank you for the information that you have given us in so many forms. Thank you that we have the record of what took place through the Great Disappointment and the emergence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church that you raised up. Thank you for showing us how this church has been lured away through the same way that Satan acted even on ancient Israel, by luring them to worship a different God, by offering them things of this world. And we know that even though we feel that we're alone, we know that you do have 7,000 in Israel, and there are many, many people in your church and in other denominations just waiting to hear the truth and rejoice in it. And we thank you so much for showing it to us. In Jesus' name. Amen.